Dr. Nick Andon is working at the King College, London, but beforehand he has been working teaching English as foreign language in Senegal, also in Indonesia, and then he moved to teach in London and Oman. That happened in the period of 1981 to 1993, but since 1993 to 1999, he worked at the School of English Language Education at Science Valley University, where among others he was involved in teaching English for academic purposes, writing distance learning materials, initial teacher education, and teacher development projects. Dr. Andon joined King College in 1999, and he has worked with a number of teacher education and materials development in different projects in Gabon, Bolivia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Mexico, Argentina, and Algeria. Dr. Andon's research investigated the relationship between theory and research in second language acquisition and language teacher knowledge, beliefs, and practices. Other research interests include task-based language teaching, teacher development and expertise, the role of materials in language teaching and learning, learner autonomy and learner strategies in language learning, focus on the form within TBLT. Dr. Andon supervises PhD on language teaching methodology and materials, teacher beliefs, practices, and identities, language teaching policy and curriculum, and language learner strategies. Okay, that's the background that I can mention on behalf of Dr. Andon. However, he made correct information that I have given directly to you. Dr. Andon, I'll give the floor to you.
Great. So okay, so I hope you can see my screen now. So good morning from here in London, and I know it's afternoon in Indonesia. You might have heard that we had a big storm yesterday, and a lot of houses were damaged, but it's a very sunny day today. So today I want to talk about task-based language teaching. This is an area I've been very interested in for a number of years, and it was a subject of my PhD. Last year at the conference, I talked about the relationship between theory in applied linguistics and research in second language acquisition and language teaching. And today's talk builds on that a little bit. I want to review a couple of things from before and talk about how task-based language teaching fits with some of these theories and this research in second language acquisition, perhaps fits better than previous approaches and methods to language teaching. Okay. If I'm going too fast or if something's not clear, please let me know. I mean, the first question is why should we be interested in task-based language teaching? TBLT. It's one of many approaches, including communicative language teaching, that's been around for quite a long time. And task-based language teaching, I'd say, has also been around for 30 years, although it's gained a lot of popularity in the last 10 to 15 years. One reason for my interest in it is it's probably the approach to language teaching that has been the most discussed and researched in recent years, and it has the support of many researchers and teacher educators, although it must be pointed out that not all teachers, not all researchers are in favor of task-based language teaching. And it's also an approach that's been picked up a lot by curriculum experts and by people who make policy in education. And I think it's certainly an approach that has at least the potential, the possibility to motivate learners, and the possibility to be successful, where quite a lot of things we try in language learning classrooms are not so successful. So I think it has a lot of possibility and definitely worth considering in more detail. So today I hope to help you understand more clearly perhaps what's meant by task and also by task-based language teaching. I think those are two different things and different ways in which task-based language teaching has been put into practice in different contexts. I want to talk obviously about some of the key advantages and reasons or rationales for adopting this approach, but also some of the objections to task-based language learning and teaching. And think a little bit about how in the real world, teachers and materials designers try to integrate tasks and task-based learning with other approaches in the language learning curriculum. Okay. I'd like you to start by looking at what I think is a typical task. To me, this is a sort of fulfills all the criteria for a task. It's something that you might do with a group of intermediate learners. It's called the Judgement Task. And the main part of this task is that your learners, your students, are asked to imagine that they are judges, a panel of judges working in a group of 3 or 4 judges. And they have a number of cases to decide, and they have to make a decision. The decision is, what are you going to do with these different criminals or people accused of different crimes? And the way it would work would be that the students would get together in their group, they'd read the information, they'd think about it, they'd discuss it, and then they'd make a decision. The decision might be something like, actually, this person is not guilty, they should be allowed to go free, or this person could be sent to prison for 3 months because there are circumstances in their crime, or this person should be sent to prison for the rest of their life, and so on. So students would then work on this for a number of minutes, probably 10 or 15 minutes. And after that time, they would be required to tell the teacher and the class what they've decided, and tell the teacher and the class, and also to discuss it. So one group might have one decision, but another group might come back and say, actually, we don't agree with you. We think we should send this man to prison for much longer time, and our reasons are this. And so a little bit of a debate can take part in the class after students have made their decision. Okay, so is that clear? That to me would be a nice example of a task. Students have some information, they discuss the information, and they make a decision. And then afterwards, they present the decision back to the class. So what's the purpose of getting learners to do tasks like this? And what kind of language and skills are being focused on in this task? And what preparation and follow-up work would you expect a teacher to use with this task? Maybe just have a think about that for 1 minute. It would be nice to have a discussion going, but it's not that kind of talk today. If you just think about that for a few seconds and think about perhaps whether you might do a task like this with your class, or whether as language learners yourselves, you remember doing activities like this in your lessons, and what the purpose was. Okay, well, I think I'll answer the questions myself. I would really like to have heard your ideas about these, but we're a long way away. Clearly, the first purpose of getting learners to do tasks like these is to get them to communicate. And so task-based language teaching is an approach where learners spend a lot of time actually communicating, and really communicating, because the aim of the task is for students to work together to reach a joint decision. So they're not just pretending to say sentences, they're actually using language to make a decision together. They need to reach that decision. It's very important that they do that. That's more important than practicing language to do a task. But obviously the real purpose is that you hope that they will learn something from it, that in communicating, through communicating, learners' language gets better. What kinds of language and skills are being focused on in this task? Actually, it's quite hard to say, but and you can set up a task, but you can't predict exactly what students are going to say. And one of the reasons for that is, in a task-based approach, you don't provide students with lots of practice beforehand. You don't give them lots of language beforehand. I will talk later about how I would prepare students to do this task. But generally, you could say, well, vocabulary, there's going to be a lot of vocabulary related to crime and punishment, like prisoner, accused, court, judge, sentence, prison sentence, guilty, not guilty, and so on. I think you can predict, if learners are supposed to work in groups together to reach a joint decision, there's going to be a lot of language of discussion. So that would involve giving your opinion. I think, in my opinion, I feel that, the giving reasons for your opinion, I agree, because in my opinion, he's not guilty, or I think she was justified in stabbing her husband, or something like that. And so language of giving your opinion, of agreeing and disagreeing, and giving reasons for your opinion and giving reasons for disagreeing. And almost all tasks that students do in groups need that language of discussion, agreement, reasons, and so on. What preparation and follow-up work would you expect a teacher to use with this task? Well, I will talk a little bit about it later, but I think what's perhaps most radical about task-based language teaching is that you wouldn't expect to spend hours and hours giving students all the language they might need to carry out this task. You wouldn't drill them on this language. You wouldn't give them all the vocabulary you need to do. And because you don't prepare students with all the language they need and drill them and practice that language, clearly you can expect they're going to make a lot of mistakes. And clearly different students at different levels might be using different language to do the same task. And some students will be using very complicated or correct or very fluent language, and other students might stumble through the task but still manage to get their meanings across. And if they can do that, then that's successful. And interesting, the follow-up work would be the chance to work on language a lot more. As we'll see in the post-task phase, the teacher can say, that's really good, you've made your decisions, and we agreed more or less how long these people should be going to prison for. Now let's do a bit of language practice. Now let's look at some of the language you were all using, that I heard you using during the task, and let's work on that so that next time we do a task, you'll be able to do the task a little bit better. So it's in some ways an unusual approach in that you ask students to communicate first, and then you perhaps teach them some of the language they needed to communicate afterwards. And we'll talk about the rationale for that later on. Okay. And this relates to really one of the big questions of language teaching about implicit and explicit learning, sometimes called formal learning and communicative learning. So one of the big questions that researchers have debated over the years is the question of whether language is acquired implicitly or just sort of picked up in a natural way by being exposed to the language and doing communicative activities. you could imagine that's a little bit like me when I moved to Indonesia in 1983. I didn't go to any lessons at all, but I learned Indonesian by sitting in taxis, by going to shops, by trying to buy things, by trying to communicate by needs, by trying to be friendly to people and chat to people I met. And gradually my Indonesian got better, gradually, but rather slowly, I have to say, and not to a very great level. Or is it better to learn a language explicitly by understanding the rules of grammar, by having teachers explain things to you one bit of language at a time? And you might think that you might think about your own opinions on that. Clearly, as language learners, and I learned French and German at school, the dominant method was explicit language learning. We spent lots of time with the teacher explaining grammar rules to us. We spent lots of time doing exercises and drills. And this was a long time ago that I was at school in the 1970s. We spent almost no time communicating at all. So most second language acquisition researchers argue that language is mostly learned implicitly or subconsciously. But most teachers seem to be in favor of explicit teaching and learning. Excuse me a second. I've recently had coronavirus, COVID-19, so my throat is still a little bit bad. So explicit learning, I showed this slide last time, is sometimes compared to a builder building a wall. And here you can see a not very good builder building a not very straight wall. But the idea of the analogy is that in explicit learning, the wall is built one brick at a time. So 1 week we might learn the present tense and some vocabulary related to everyday activities. And the next week we might start learning the present continuous tense. And the week after that, we might learn about adjectives and so on. And this is my experience at school. After about 5 years, they finally say, okay, now you've learned all the little bits. You have a complete wall. You can go out and start communicating with people. This sequence of teaching is often called PPP. Each week or each lesson, the teacher presents a new piece of language. Students get a chance to practice it, and then perhaps at the end of the lesson, if there's time, you get a chance to communicate, to talk about yourself using that new language. So for example, if you're learning the present tense, you might get to talk about your daily routine or about your hobbies and activities at the end of the lesson to your classmates. Very often in classes I've observed, there's a lot of presentation and a lot of practice, but there often isn't enough time for production. So students don't get very much chance to communicate using the new language they've learned. I would say also it's quite a boring approach to language teaching, and it doesn't build up your confidence because you never get to practice actually communicating very much in the real world. And I remember after several years of speaking French at school, of learning French at school, I really wasn't able to speak it when I went to France. I had to learn, relearn using communication by communicating with people when I moved to France. An implicit approach is sometimes called an immersion approach, where you immerse someone in water, and it's sometimes called a deep end approach, because it's a bit like taking a child and saying, okay, today you're going to learn to swim, but I'm not going to teach you anything. I'm just going to pick you up and throw you into the deep end of the swimming pool or the deep end of the sea. And that can be quite scary, although this child doesn't look very scared. He seems to be enjoying himself quite a lot. But the idea is that actually in implicit learning, you'll learn a language best not by focusing on grammar rules, but by being given chances to communicate, to listen to people around you, to read things in the language, to try to speak yourself, communicate your needs and your desires and what you want to talk about, and perhaps by writing as well. And perhaps my experience of moving to Indonesia and not understanding a word around me is a little bit like that, a deep end approach, quite scary at first. And it takes a long time. I lived in Indonesia for 4 years, and I learned quite a lot, but I also realized that there is a lot I didn't learn, and particularly I didn't learn how to read and write in Indonesian. So communicative language teaching is sometimes considered an implicit approach, but it has been argued that over hundreds of years, language teaching has shifted between grammar-based explicit approaches and communicative-based approaches and back and so on. But certainly in my lifetime, perhaps there's been starting from much more grammar-based approaches and a movement towards more communication-based approaches. I think the reality is that in most classes, teachers mix both. They spend some time on communication activities, and they spend some time on grammar-based or explicit teaching activities. And sometimes they've tried to find ways to integrate these. Moving on to the next slide. I'll just gloss over this kind of table that shows some of the difference between implicit and explicit learning. One difference is that very often you don't tell learners, today we're going to learn this. You might say, today we're going to do an interesting task about crimes and punishment, but you might not tell them we're practicing vocabulary related to this topic, and we're going to learn some new ways to take part in a discussion. You don't generally explain rules, and right from the start, you encourage students to try to use language freely, whereas within an explicit approach, you practice the language first, but you might later on in the lesson encourage free use of the language. Yeah. Where does task-based language teaching fit into this? Well, I think it's seen mainly as a deep-end approach or an implicit approach where the main point is communicating. But it has been argued, especially by Mike Long, who's an American SLA researcher who's very famous, that task-based language teaching can combine the advantages of implicit communicative approaches and explicit grammar-focused approaches by providing the best opportunities for focusing on form. And as I mentioned before, the best time for doing that may be after students have done the task. And the teacher has seen what they can do and what they can't do and build on that. So I'll come back to that idea of focus on form later. So very briefly, what is a task? I think this is a very simple and clear basic definition. Any activity that requires learners to use language with an emphasis on meaning in order to obtain an objective. So our task asks learners to work together to use language, to think about meaning more than the words they were using, and to make a decision, which is the objective. I really like this more complicated definition from Ellis and Shintani because they describe a task. They provide 4 key characteristics. I know there are 5 there, I've added one. The main focus should be on meaning. So when the learners are doing the task, they shouldn't be thinking too much about not making mistakes or about what grammar points they're using. They should mainly be thinking about how long are we going to send these people to prison? There needs to be some kind of gap, the need to convey information or express an opinion or to infer meaning. And in this case, the gap is between the information we provided in the task about what these 4 people had done wrong and in a way the decision about what their punishment should be. But there's also a gap because different people in the class, different learners will have different opinions and experiences and they'll be bringing those experiences to the class, and there'll be a need to communicate between them. So there's something to communicate. The answers are not obvious, and different people will come with different ideas about this. The third one I think is very interesting and quite controversial, and that's that learners should largely rely on their own resources, their own language that they already have, rather than being given new language to use in the task, and also their own ideas, their non-linguistic resources. They shouldn't be told what to think, they should think for themselves. That is, learners should not be taught the language, although they might pick up some language from the little bits they were reading at the beginning. The fourth one is really important. There's a clearly defined outcome. In the case of that task we looked at, it was a decision, but it could be a choice or a plan for something to do, or it could be a solution to a problem, something like that. And when performing the task, learners should have that objective in mind, that outcome in mind, and focus on that. The last one, which comes from a separate definition from Ellis, is that a task should involve real-world processes of language use. It should be a bit like using language in the real world. I think I've had about 25 minutes, about 15 minutes left. There's another definition by Peter Skin, but I'll leave that. You'll be able to read the PowerPoint later, and so on. More definitions. Just one thing to point out from that, we often think that tasks and communicative activities are all about speaking. But actually, as Ellis points out, a task could be a listening task, a reading task, or a writing task. So that's what that's about. Here are some typical examples of tasks that involve a decision or a plan or a problem to be solved or an interview and so on. Just have spend a few minutes looking through those and think about perhaps what's the outcome, what's the objective, what do students arrive at the end that they need to report back to their teacher and their class at the end. Okay, and so in the first one, students have to make a decision. They're the employer. They need to decide which one of their staff they unfortunately have to get rid of and which one they can manage without. The second one involves making a plan, which is a nice idea, very common in task-based language teaching. The third one is solving a problem. The fourth one is like a role play in a way, and lots of role plays are not tasks, but if it's a role play where you have to make a choice between different interviewees and then say we choose this one, then that role play has an outcome and a decision. And the fifth one is really a matching task. You have some information about different houses and some information about different families and their needs, and you have to try to match them. That's also a very nice task. And I think you can contrast that activity, those activities, with something like this, where students are talking in pairs. They can see these pictures and there is a kind of something to talk about, but basically it's just a drill. Students are saying to one another, what's she doing? And they point at the first picture and the other student says, she's water skiing. And the first student says, yeah, that's right. And second picture, what's he doing? He's cycling. So it looks quite communicative in a way, but nothing's being communicated because both students can see the picture. There's no information gap. There's no purpose or outcome to saying these things. They're just practicing language. There's no communication taking place. This is a drill or a practice exercise. It involves displaying how well you can speak language, but it doesn't involve communicating. Very useful. It helps students become fluent and master this particular grammar point of present progressive tense, but it doesn't help you to communicate. So what happens when teachers use tasks? Generally, we agree that actually there are three phases. In the pre-task phase, the teachers might provide learners with the materials they need to do the task. And perhaps the teacher might talk about the topic and what might be involved. She might relate the topic to students' own lives. They might talk about, in the case of crime and punishment, or if the task about planning a holiday, they might ask students to talk about their best holiday or a recent holiday or what they're planning to do in the summer holidays coming up and so on. A key thing is the teacher should not really try to pre-teach the language or the grammar students might need to do the task, but she might choose to highlight some useful vocabulary and expressions that they might want to use in the task. But I think it should be clear that that's useful language, but they don't have to use it. They can use whatever language they want, and so on. One of the reasons for not trying to pre-teach the activity is that some learners may already know that language, and some learners may know other language they could use instead, so that's fine. The main phase is the task phase, where you give students a task, you make sure it's clear to them what they need to do, what the outcome is. Make sure it's clear to them that at the end of 10 minutes or 15 minutes, each group, or at least some of the groups, will be asked to stand up and explain to the whole class what they decided. And then there should be a chance for the whole class to respond to their ideas, agree, disagree, and so on. And clearly, while the students are doing this activity, the idea is the teacher should be going around the class, listening in, helping students if necessary, but really the main task of the teacher is to monitor and make a note of the language learners are using, make a note of any errors perhaps, but also to make a note of, oh, that was interesting, they're using some really interesting language there. So it's not just about errors, it's also about really good, useful language that the teacher notices some of the students are using maybe for the first time. Right, after the task, I think there are two things. The first thing is really important. That's the teacher needs to really find out what learners have decided. So to focus on the outcome. What did they decide, or what did they plan? And that should be presented to the whole class so people can discuss it further. And that's really worth spending time on. It gives a purpose to the task phase. It wasn't just practice, it was actually an interesting activity, and we're interested in what the students thought and what they decided. Secondly, is the language focus phase. At this point, the teacher can point out the errors, point out any useful language, and so on. This is called focus on form. And then after that, this might lead on to another task, for example, writing about a decision, or writing about the holiday you planned, or interviewing someone about the judgment or something like that, or just a completely new task and so on. One thing you can do is, after you've done the focus on form stage and fed in some useful language, is repeat the task perhaps the next week or another similar task and see if learners are doing better. The task repetition is an interesting thing. So this is the focus on form, the language stage. After the task, usually after the task, the teacher can provide an opportunity to think about language and to work on language point. Might simply mean working on errors. The teacher could write some of the mistakes on the whiteboard and ask students to see if they can correct the errors. But the starting point could be some language that is not an error, some of the great things that learners have said. Also, the teacher can put something on the whiteboard and say, can anyone suggest some more ways to say the same thing? And this is often called extension, so you can think of more things. Focus on form after the task is reactive. And the good thing about that is it can provide exactly the language students need. You can say, oh, students, quite a few people are having a problem with articles. Let's point out some of those. Clearly, the teacher can't work on all the language, all the errors she's noticed. So she'll try to pick out things that quite a few people have had problems with. And she's trying to pick out things that learners are ready to learn. She can include some drills and practice activities, but not spend a long time on them. And the aim is just to point out things to students, make students aware that there's a gap between what they said and what a native speaker or a more advanced speaker might say. But then it's not expected that they will master this and they'll know it. Okay. Can someone tell me how much time I've got left? I think it's about 5 or 10 minutes.
You have around 10 minutes. The time.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. 10 minutes. I'll probably finish in a little bit less than that.
Okay. Right.
Okay. I think this approach, first of all, is justified and fits very well with something I talked about last year. Principles for instructed second language learning. These are a set of principles by Ellis, where he says that these are the key conditions we need to create in order for people to learn. And these are also, this is from Rod Ellis. He's been talking about these since about 2008, and he's really perhaps one of the most well-known and most active researchers in second language acquisition. Based on all his reading in second language acquisition, he came up with these principles. I reordered them a little bit, but these are really the key ones. That predominantly there needs to be a focus on meaning. Most of the time in lessons needs to be learners trying to communicate meanings. But very importantly, there also does need to be opportunities to focus on form, to focus on grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, expressions, and so on. And the third one is about input. In other words, listening to language and reading language. Learners need a rich and meaningful exposure to language in use. So real language, authentic language that's actually being used to communicate something and not just being read to answer questions or something like that. The fourth one is about output. In other words, learners speaking and writing in the classroom. They need opportunities for purposeful communication in the L2. So learners need to be able to communicate their own meanings, to speak and to write, in order to communicate with other people in the classroom. And so both 3 and 4, when students are listening and reading and speaking and writing, it's still important. Number 1 is important. When they're doing so, they should be focusing on communicating meanings. Number 5 means that the best way to learn is when 2 or more learners are speaking together, interacting together, trying to communicate their meanings with one another, exchanging the roles of speaker and listener. And the 6th one is about motivation. Learners need to be affectively and cognitively engaged. They need to be engaged with their emotions. So they need to be interested, maybe made happy or angry by the topics, but also they need to be made to use their brains to really think. So the example of the judgment task means actually you have to think quite hard about these cases and think about, what do I feel, you know? And if they feel the task is worth doing, I think they'll do it better, and so on. Jane Willis, who's a teacher educator who's written a lot about task-based language teaching, points out that there are these 4 key conditions to language learning, and it's similar to what the previous slide says. Learners need to be exposed to lots of language, rich, comprehensible input of real spoken language. They also need to produce language, to use language themselves, to do things, to exchange meanings. They need to be motivated, and if learners are motivated, they'll pick up the language they were exposed to and try to use it themselves in their own output. And the 4th thing is really about focus on form. They also need some opportunities to focus on form and to have explanations from the teachers and do practice activities. When I reflect back on my school days, there was not really much exposure to real language. We didn't read much except made up stories. We certainly didn't get much chance to speak and communicate in the classroom. We just did lots of writing sentences, and maybe we would speak sentences, but we wouldn't communicate. We would never talk about our own ideas. Motivation, there wasn't much. It wasn't very exciting. We were motivated by the teacher, who would get very angry if you made mistakes, but it wasn't a very joyful process. Instruction, by which Willis means not just the teacher giving explanations, but also students doing exercises and practice drills. That's all we did a lot of the time. And it kind of worked for me. I know it didn't work for a lot of people, but it's very slow and boring. Okay. There are a number of rationales for getting learners to do tasks and using a task-based approach. It helps learners to develop confidence in using the language. It helps them to practice really spontaneous interaction. They can notice how their classmates and their teacher express things. They practice things like turn taking. They're using language purposefully. They're not just producing sentences, which was all I did at school, but they're actually having discussions and debates and making presentations. They can try out communication strategies, and they develop confidence. There are other sets of rationales related to second language acquisition. Carrying out tasks is considered to trigger second language acquisition. And the reason for this is that it's believed that second language acquisition is triggered by communication. And so the idea is that learners will pick up new language and start to acquire new language from taking part in tasks, language that nobody's taught them. But at the same time, they may also become more fluent in language that they have heard already. And the other thing is that different learners in a class will all be at different levels, but they can all learn what they're ready to notice next. So they're not all learning the same thing, but hopefully they're all learning something useful. I think there are some other practical advantages. Tasks are really like using language in the real world, and so it helps students to prepare for actually transferring what they've learned in the classroom outside to the world outside. Secondly, if learners are learning English or another language to be doctors or to be engineers or to be pharmacists or to be travel agents, you can design tasks that are related to their jobs, their careers, and so on. I already mentioned that tasks can help promote fluency. They can develop confidence. One thing a lot of teachers say to me is tasks provide enjoyment. They use them on a Friday afternoon when students are tired. They're a bit different from the other class, and so they can be very motivating. Last one's really important. If you get learners to do tasks as a teacher and listen to what they're saying, you can kind of think, oh, they know that already. I was planning to teach that next week, but I can see everyone can do that. Or, oh, I thought they knew about present perfect tense, but I can see they're still having problems. I think we'll focus a bit more on that next week. So tasks can be a really good diagnostic tool for teachers and help them to see what learners already know and what they can't do, and you can plan next week's lessons based on that. There are nevertheless problems with tasks, and these are some of them. There's a lack of evidence that a pure task-based approach would work, and I don't think anyone has really tried it. It's so different from what I experienced at school, and I think a lot of teachers find it difficult to implement because they have no experience of learning like this as learners themselves. So if it's not the way you're used to studying at school, it's going to be difficult for you to teach in this way. Teachers have a lot of difficulty understanding what TBLT is about and what is a task and what's not a task. And this idea of a task must have a real communicative outcome, and real communication needs to be taking place in the classroom is quite difficult for teachers to grasp sometimes. There aren't good books of task-based materials for teachers to use. Different people understand the approach in different ways. people worry that actually learners will just use their L1, or they'll just use very simple language, or they'll never pick up new language, they'll just use the language they already know. The answer to that may be that the focus on form stage at the post-task stage is a good chance to really push students to use more adventurous language. People worry that there may be noisy classrooms, or they might be difficult to control the discipline in the class, or that learners might not be doing the task and so on. Actually, it may also be quite a difficult skill for teachers, particularly if you have to, immediately after the task, you have to explain some grammar points to the learners without preparation and so on. And testing tasks might be difficult. I'm going to move on to the last couple of things. I think this is a useful checklist, but you can see it on the PowerPoint later. I think this is another useful thing, but I'd just like to point out that task-based language teaching is quite difficult for teachers. They have a lot to do. They need to provide feedback. They need to incorporate a focus on form. They need to provide ample input. They might need to model or practice the performance of the task beforehand. And teachers need to decide which language, out of all the language students are using, are we going to focus on. It is possible to combine task-based language teaching with more traditional teaching, and there are different ways to do this. I think one way to do it would be to focus mainly on interesting tasks, but to feed in language at different times. And another way would be, I think, to perhaps spend some lessons every week doing tasks and communication activities, but to be on the safe side, and also to account for the fact that different learners learn in different ways, it might be a good idea to do some grammar-based lessons and some task-based lessons, but not necessarily to try to tie those together in any way. Okay, I'm going to really finish there. I think I've said really the main things I want to say, and you can read the PowerPoint, which will be made available to you. But I'd just like to point out, as a final slide, the tasks do meet principles of second language acquisition. One thing I like about them is they really are handing over responsibility and effort to the learners. I've seen some fantastic teachers running around the classroom, explaining things, trying to get learners to respond, and learners are there on their desks, half asleep all the time. And I think actually learners are the ones who need to be working hard in lessons, and teachers should prepare the lesson and give it to learners and really be a bit relaxed. Otherwise we'll all get overtired. Key thing, it allows for differentiation. Different learners can learn at different paces, and everyone can learn what they need to learn. I think it provides motivation by providing a sense of achievement. Pupils can see if they're able to communicate and get their messages across to others, and it provides evidence of learning and what learners can do. Okay, I'll end there, and yeah, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, sir. Am I audible?
Yes.
All right. Good afternoon, sir. Or should I say, selamat sore, Pak. Dr.
Selamat sore.
Yeah, good. My name is Rizky Uli, and I'm going to lead the question and answer session. And I have with me several questions. I have compiled several questions, and please allow me to share the screen.
So I need to stop screen sharing.
Yes, I hope my screen is available for you all to see. So the first question, the first questions come from Ms. Santri Jahimo. Nick, when and in what forms do feedbacks take place, and when using TBLT?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question, Santri. I hope I've sort of predicted it to some extent by saying generally, Mike Long is very clear. He says it should be after the task, and it should be reactive, by which he means is wait and see what learners can do and cannot do in the task, and then provide some feedback after the task. Rod Ellis, who's another great researcher, he says actually you can try and predict what problem students are going to have and give them sort of pre-feedback before the task. What forms should feedback take place? I think this is difficult because it's difficult for teachers to plan it on the spot, and I think it's legitimate for a teacher to note down errors and say, actually, I'm going to think about some of these and do them next week instead. I'm going to plan my feedback. But it's quite good to do some quick feedback. And I think a quick way to do it is just have some notes made as you go around the classroom as a teacher and just write them up on the whiteboard. And maybe even, while students are doing the task, just write a few things on the whiteboard. And after students have done the task, after you've done some feedback on the outcome, on the ideas in the task, that's really important. I've seen many times teachers say, okay, well done, you've done the task, I listened to you, now I'm going to correct your errors. I think that's a real shame. Students need to hear what other groups have done. But after that, that's a good time for feedback. But maybe next week is also a good time for feedback. And just a simple thing of putting things on the whiteboard and just discussing them with learners, seeing if they know the answers and so on. What forms? I think that's a really important thing, Santri. I'd say feedback is supposed to be just quick, just point something out quickly, just point out, see something, and don't necessarily expect students to remember it. But after you've pointed things out 2 or 3 times, some of them will start to remember them, and you'll see some of them start to use them. You can do a little bit of practice. I mean, one teacher I saw would go away in the break and write a little exercise for learners and hand that out to them and so on. But just a quick pointing out of problems and not expecting learners to master it. To say, I'd just like to point this out. It's quite good to say to learners, get in the habit of writing down what we write on the board. Go home and study it on your own. I hope that answers your question, Sandri.
Thank you so much, sir. And the second question, comes from Ricardo Besi, and the question is like this: is it possible to unveil a cognitively based activity sequencing pattern within TBL, task-based learning?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Would Ricardo like to say a bit more about it?
While waiting to Ricardo, I think it's best for us to jump to the next questions. Is it okay, Dr. Andon?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. The next question is, sorry. Do you think this approach, TBLT, is going to be successful in doing a group task? Because in fact, mostly some students are not actively participating in the group. So what's the best way for the teacher to justify that all students have come to reach objectives of this learning approach? From Charles Zacharias. And Dr. Andon, you may proceed.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that question, Charles. I know that's a concern lots of teachers have. And I talked about this in when I was interviewed by Dr. Pauline Foster, and I can see this concern. I know from my experience, maybe I was never the best teacher, but I know that there were always learners who weren't actively participating in the class anyway. They sat at the back, whatever we were doing, they weren't participating. And so I don't think it's a problem that's particularly related to task-based language teaching. And funnily enough, I think it's a problem that task-based teaching can address. First of all, you know, when learners are doing a task, they're the ones who are busy, and the teacher now has some free time to go around the room and try to encourage those who aren't participating, and at least make them aware that, you know, you're not trying. Secondly, you're giving learners a task to do. You're saying, okay, your group, you've got a job to do, responsibility, you need to do this task. And at the end of 10 minutes, I'm going to pick on your group and say, right, can you tell me what you've done? And if they've done nothing, you know, that hopefully they're going to be embarrassed. If they haven't done if they've done the task in Bahasa Indonesia and not in English, they're going to struggle to express their ideas in English. And I think, you know, that puts some pressure on them to try a bit harder next time. I think perhaps just one other thing to add is, you know, we need to explain to learners why they're doing it. Why are we doing tasks and not just getting you to sit down to listen to me, the boring old teacher, explain stuff? And if you can explain some of these principles, I think I would use that very nice diagram from Jane Willis to say, these are the 4 things you need to learn a language: exposure, opportunities to use language, motivation, and instruction. I'm the teacher, I can do the instruction, but most of the time you've got to be reading, listening, exposed to language, speaking and writing, using language productively. We need to explain to teachers, as teachers, we need to explain to students what our principles are and why we do things. And you can say to them, you know, you can hide at the back of the class when we do tasks, you can do nothing, but you're not going to learn anything, and it's not my fault. Do you want to learn English or not? Yeah, but it's a very good question. And I know my answer is simplistic. It's a real struggle, but it's an important thing to work on. Hi, Novendi, this is a really good question too. How to get everyone in a group to participate. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Since we haven't heard from more elaborations of explanations from the previous questions, we will proceed to the next questions, which is from Novendi Naben. And the question is, does each group member participate by giving their opinion? If it is represented by one person to give the opinion of all group members, then can it be ensured that all group members get learning progress by using TBLT method? Thank you, sir.
Another really good question. Another really good question. And this is really the skill of teachers, and teachers going around the class will notice this. Not in one lesson, over time you notice, oh, that Bambang never speaks in the class, I wonder why. And you know as teachers that this is a really difficult problem, and you know as teachers that you have techniques to deal with it. You know, I'm sure you've all tried different things. One is to say, okay, you're working in groups of 4. You have to appoint somebody to take notes, somebody to lead the discussion and be a kind of chairperson, somebody who's going to be the spokesperson who presents your answers back to the class later, and the 4th person has another job. And you can also say, you know, each lesson we're going to rotate these roles so everyone gets a chance to do them. As teachers, I'm sure you know you can organize groups by putting the weaker students together and the stronger students together, or you have mixed groups. You might talk to the stronger student in each group to say, okay, today you're the chairperson, but you're also the teacher of this group, and your job is to make sure you get opinions from all the others and they're all talking and so on. And by the way, between doing the task and presenting the task back to teachers, between doing the task and presenting your ideas back to the whole class, Jane Willis recommends that the group sits down and spends a few minutes planning their presentation. So they work together to plan exactly what they're going to say to the class. And she argues that while they're doing that, they're really focusing on language accuracy. But yeah, difficult problem, but we know there are ways to attack that. No easy answers, but we need to get everyone participating. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. The answer is very enlightening for us, all of us. And that is all the session for question and answer. And I would like to ask you to also give your closing remarks, and you may proceed with the closing remarks, Doctor.
Okay, so, I would say thank you very much for listening after all. And I would say, try to use more tasks in the classroom, but try to use them in a structured way. And task-based language teaching is not easy, and it involves careful planning. But I think for a lot of students, it's very, very rewarding. Yeah.
Is that it, sir?
Yeah, would you like me to say more? I could keep talking for a long time, but I think I've said everything I'd like to say today.
Thank you so much, sir. That is all the session for the first talk from Dr. Nick Andon, and we may proceed to the second talk, which is from Dr. Daniel Seri.